The clang of metal against metal echoed through the garage. Jason wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a dark oil trail. The old Ford needed some serious repairs, but this was the kind of work he liked best. Complex, painstaking, requiring total immersion. "Hey, Jay, your fiancé's here to see you," Pete shouted from the office. Jason smiled as he heard the familiar voice of Kate talking to the manager. "Give me 5 minutes." He hurriedly wiped his hands with a rag and tried to clean himself up. Kate was standing at the entrance to the work area, holding a container of lunch. Her blonde hair was gathered into a neat ponytail, and her blue medical uniform looked immaculate, even after a 12-hour shift at the hospital. "Thought I'd check to see if you remembered to eat again," she pecked his cheek, ignoring the machine oil stains. "You're my savior," Jason pulled her against him. "How was the shift?" "Tough. 2 emergencies, 1 surgery delayed. But I'm more worried about you. You look exhausted." Jason waved it off. "Just a lot of work. We're about to put a down payment on the house, so we need to pick up the slack." They settled into the small rec room. Kate pulled out homemade sandwiches and a thermos of hot coffee. Jason greedily pounced on the food, only now realizing how hungry he was. "Aunt Linda called," he reported casually. "She's inviting me over for dinner this Friday." "Oh, how is she? I haven't seen her since the wake." "She's hanging in there. Says work helps keep her mind off things. You know, sometimes I think she works too much." Kate stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "That's normal. It's only been 6 months. Everyone deals with grief in their own way." Jason nodded. Uncle Robert's death had been a blow to everyone. Especially for Linda. They had lived together for 20 years. Jason often remembered his uncle fiddling with him as a kid, teaching him how to understand cars, supporting his decision to go into auto mechanics instead of college. "Speaking of work," Kate put her hand on his shoulder. "Are you really okay? You've been kind of sluggish the last few weeks, always complaining about being tired." "Just overwork. 6 days a week. Sometimes I stay late." "Why don't you get yourself tested, just in case?" Jason grumbled. "Come on, it's fine. Once the house deal closes, I'll take a couple days off, get some sleep." Kate didn't insist, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She'd always been like that, caring to the point of excess, probably a nurse's professional deformity. After lunch, they discussed wedding plans. Kate wanted a small ceremony at a local church, just close friends and family. Jason was in complete agreement. The important thing was to have money for a down payment on a house. "You know what I'm thinking?" Kate smiled dreamily. "About how we're going to live in our own house, having a dog, maybe kids. Let's just get the house sorted out first," Jason laughed. "Otherwise, we'll have to live in the garage." The day dragged on slowly. By evening, the usual tiredness had set in. His head was a little dizzy, but Jason chalked it up to the heat of the workshop. When he got home, he collapsed exhausted on the couch. His phone rang with a message from Linda. "Don't forget Friday. I'll make your favorite apple pie." Jason smiled. After his parents died, Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert had replaced his family. Now that his uncle was gone, he felt a special responsibility for his aunt. The next few days passed like a blur. Jason often woke up in a cold sweat, but he stubbornly went to work. Friday morning, he threw up right in the workshop. "Boy, you should see a doctor." Pete shook his head, holding out a bottle of water. "It'll pass on its own," Jason dismissed it. But deep down, he began to doubt his own words. That evening, he and Kate drove to Linda's house. The house greeted them with the smell of fresh baked goods and soft music. Auntie looked better than the last time she'd been there. She'd gotten a haircut, put on a smart dress. "My dears," she hugged them both. "How glad I am to see you." Over dinner, Linda asked about wedding plans, work, home. Jason noticed her furtively wiping her eyes when it came to the ceremony. "Robert would be so proud of you," she said quietly. After dessert, Jason was woozy again. He apologized and hurried to the bathroom. Kate found him pale, leaning on the sink. "That's enough," the steel of a nurse sounded in her voice. "You go to the doctor on Monday. I'll make your own appointment with Dr. Rodriguez." Jason wanted to object, but his strength finally left him. He just nodded. "What's wrong?" Linda looked anxiously into the bathroom. Nothing's wrong, Aunt Lynn. Jason squeezed out a smile. Just an upset stomach. Later, lying sleepless in his apartment, he was truly scared for the first time. Something was wrong, something serious, but he couldn't have imagined how different his life would be after seeing a doctor. Dr. Rodriguez's office smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Jason fidgeted nervously with the edge of his chart as the nurse filled out the paperwork. Kate had insisted on a full workup, tests, x-rays, almost a CAT scan. Better to be overinsured, she said. Dr. Rodriguez turned out to be a middle-aged woman with an attentive gaze and a soothing voice. She methodically questioned about symptoms, taking notes, frowning. When did the first signs of malaise appear? Jason hesitated. About 2 months ago. Just fatigue at first, then started having trouble sleeping, fever. Have you had unprotected intercourse in the last year? No, I have a steady partner. We're getting married soon. The doctor nodded, but something in her look made Jason tense. Okay, wait in the hallway for the results. It'll take about an hour. The hallway was stuffy. Jason was leafing through an old magazine, not really reading the text. There was a baby crying nearby, someone talking loudly on the phone. Time dragged on interminably. When the nurse invited him back into the office, Dr. Rodriguez looked more serious than usual. Have a seat, Mr. Clark. I have some unpleasant news. The next few minutes merged into one endless nightmare. The words, HIV positive and therapy must be started, sounded like through absorbent cotton. Jason felt the room slowly spinning around him. There's some kind of mistake, his voice sounded hoarse. Test it again. We ran 2 tests. The results are unambiguous, I'm very sorry. But that's impossible, I've always… And then a memory struck him like lightning. That night. Uncle Robert's funeral, whiskey, lots of whiskey. He remembered everyone leaving. How he stayed behind to help Linda clean up. How she cried on his shoulder. How one touch had turned into another. They were both drunk, both heartbroken. It had happened on its own, quickly, desperately, senselessly. In the morning, they silently agreed never to bring it up again, to pretend it never happened, to go back to normal. Mr. Clark? The doctor's voice brought him back to reality. You need to inform your partner immediately. She needs to take some tests. Kate. Oh my God, Kate. How long has it been since you were infected? Based on the results, 4 to 6 months. Right. The funeral was 5 months ago. I'll write up referrals for more tests. We need to determine the viral load and find a therapy. With modern drugs, you can keep the disease under control. Jason nodded without listening. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts. How to tell Kate? How to explain the cheating? How did Linda get HIV? Did she know? When he left the hospital, he sat in the car for a long time, staring at one point. His phone vibrated. Kate was asking how the appointment had gone. Linda had sent a picture of a new pie recipe. Normal life went on, but things had already changed for him. In the evening, he couldn't stand it and drove to his aunt's house, needed to know the truth. Linda opened the door in her house robe with a cup of tea in her hands. Jason, is something wrong? He walked silently into the house. Everything in the living room was still as it had been under Uncle Robert. His chair, his books, his pictures on the walls. I went to the doctor today, he began, trying to speak calmly. Oh my God, is it something serious? There was genuine concern in her voice. Yes, Aunt Lynn, very serious. He turned to her. I have HIV. The cup slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Linda went pale, grabbing the back of her chair. It can't be, she whispered. It can, and we both know how it happened. Jason, you knew? His voice shook with rage. That night, you knew? Linda sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders were shaking. Answer me. Yes, she said, barely audible. I knew. Jason felt the ground go from under his feet. He slumped against the wall, trying to keep his balance. How long ago? 2 years. Robert, he hasn't been faithful to me. I found out by accident when I had routine tests. And you kept quiet? All that time? I couldn't tell. It would have killed his reputation, his memory. Would it kill me? Jason felt a wave of nausea rising inside. I trusted you. You were like a mother to me. I loved you. I love you. That night, I wasn't myself. I was so lonely, so hurt. Shut up." He never raised his voice at her. "Don't you dare make excuses. You ruined my life. How am I going to tell Kate? How am I going to look her in the eye now?" Linda stood up, trying to walk over to him. "Jason, please. Don't come near me." He backed toward the door. "I don't want to see you again, ever." Leaping out of the house, he got into his car and drove off, unable to see the road. Kate's face was in front of his eyes, her happy smile as they discussed the future. A future that wouldn't exist now. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized that modern medicine made it possible to live with HIV for a long, almost normal life. That there was therapy, there was support, there was hope. But right now, he could think of only one thing: the woman he trusted the most in the world after Kate had betrayed him in the worst possible way. The phone vibrated again. Kate was texting, "Love, how are you? Very worried." Jason parked at the curb and cried. The first time he'd cried since his uncle's funeral. Cried with pain, with fear, with rage. The realization that he had to find the strength to tell the truth to the woman he loved. And the horror of knowing that after that, his life would never be the same again. After his conversation with Dr. Rodriguez, Jason didn't go home. He drove recklessly through the city at night, trying to wrap his mind around the terrible truth. His aunt, his second mother, had deliberately condemned him to a lifelong illness. How could she? Why had she kept silent all these months? How many times after that night they had seen each other, talked, had dinner together? And each time, she knew she'd ruined his life, but she kept smiling, baking her pies, asking about wedding plans. The phone vibrated again. Kate. He couldn't bring himself to answer it. How to explain the truth to her? How do you admit to cheating and cheating like that? That night, after the funeral, it had seemed so simple. They were both drunk on grief and whiskey. Linda was crying on his shoulder. "You look so much like him when you were young," she whispered. And then, in the morning, they had agreed to forget about it. And they had forgotten. At least he had forgotten. Had she? Jason parked in front of Linda's house. The lights were on, so she was awake. He headed for the door. Linda opened it right away, as if she'd been expecting him. She was wearing Robert's old robe and holding the same cup of tea. "I knew you'd come," she said quietly, letting him into the house. "Knew?" He grinned unhappily. "Like you knew about your illness when you seduced me?" Linda shuddered. "Let's sit down. I owe you an explanation." "Explain?" Jason felt the rage rising inside. "What's there to explain? You knew you were sick, knew you could infect me, and still—" "Sit down, please." She lowered herself into Robert's chair. "You must know the whole story." He remained standing, leaning against the wall. "I found out about the diagnosis 2 years ago," Linda began. "Robert? He wasn't faithful to me, a casual liaison on a business trip. When he found out he was sick, he told me right away. We decided to cope together, drank medicine, went to doctors, didn't tell anyone." "What does that have to do with it?" Jason interrupted. "I'm asking about something else. After he died, I was all alone. You were the only one who stopped by, supported me, and I started to look at you differently. You're so much like him, young, full of life." "You're crazy," Jason whispered. "I guess so." She grinned unfunnily. "I tried to fight those feelings, but when you held me that night, when we were so close—" "Stop it!" He kicked the coffee table in fury. "I was drunk, upset, and you just took advantage of the moment." "Yes," she replied quietly. "I did, because I knew it was my only chance." "A chance to what? To ruin my life?" "A chance to feel alive." Her voice shook. "To not just be poor widow, poor Linda for once. To be wanted, to be loved." "Loved?" He laughed a terrible, barking laugh. "You are sick! You're really sick, and it's not about HIV." "I know." She covered her face with her hands. "I know it's not normal, but I couldn't help myself. You were the only light in my life." "What about my life?" He loomed over her. "What about Kate? Our future? You knew we were going to get married, have kids." "I hoped it would turn out okay," she whispered. "I'm on medication, My viral load is low. And that's why you chose to keep quiet? His voice trailed off with rage. Let me live in ignorance? Make plans? I was afraid of losing you, she raised her tearful eyes to him. You were the only one who stayed with me after Robert died. The only one who cared. Cared? He recoiled. I loved you like a mother, trusted you, and you betrayed that trust in the most disgusting way. I'm sorry. She reached for him. Don't touch me. He recoiled as if from fire. You're disgusting. You've not only ruined my life, you've dishonored Uncle Robert's memory. No, please, listen. Enough. He grabbed his jacket. I don't want to hear any more of your excuses. Don't call me, don't write. Forget I exist. He stormed out of the house, leaving Linda sobbing in her husband's chair. Getting into his car, he dialed a number with shaky hands. Kate, we need to talk, now. Linda watched through the window as Jason's car pulled away. In her hands, she clutched a photograph of her and Robert on their wedding day. So young, so happy, so full of hope. I'm sorry, she whispered to the photo. I've ruined everything. Everything you loved. Everything we were building. She knew Jason would never forgive her. Knew she deserved his hatred. But a part of her, that sick, twisted part, still longed for him. For that one moment of intimacy for which she'd sacrificed everything. Her pills were on the table. A daily reminder of Robert's betrayal. Her own downfall. Jason's ruined life. She picked up the vial. Rolled it in the palm of her hand. How easy it would be to take them all at once. To walk away like Robert had left. Suddenly, leaving behind only questions and regrets. But she knew she didn't deserve such an easy way out. Her punishment would be to live with the realization of what she'd done, with the memory of Jason's look of disgust and hatred, with the emptiness in the house that once held so much love. She went up to the second floor, to the bedroom where Robert's things were still stored, pulled a box of family photos out of the closet. Here was Jason as a baby, sitting on his uncle's lap. Here's his first bicycle, graduation, the engagement to Kate. Linda methodically tore the photos into small pieces. She had no right to hold on to these memories any longer. She had no right to pretend to be a part of this family. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. Somewhere in the city, Jason was telling Kate the truth, ruining their shared future. And Linda sat among the scraps of the past, realizing that some sins have no atonement, and some confessions make loneliness final. In 2 weeks, Jason had lost everything. Kate listened to his confused confession, silently packed her things and left. So many sick days had piled up at work that Pete had been forced to fire him. Sorry, kid, but clients can't wait forever. He sat in the empty apartment, looking at the box of Kate's stuff she'd forgotten to pick up. Photos, postcards, little things that reminded him of happier days. Dr. Rodriguez had said that with modern medicines, one could live a long, almost normal life. But how do you go on living when everything that made life normal has crumbled to dust? The doorbell rang, taking him by surprise. Linda stood on the threshold, pale, gaunt, with a kind of wild glint in her eyes. What do you want? He asked tiredly. To talk. She stepped into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. I owe you an explanation. You've already explained everything. He didn't move from his seat. Go away. No, listen. She grabbed his arm. I know how to fix this. We can be together. I'll sell the house. We'll go somewhere where no one knows us. Have you lost your mind? He wrenched his hand away. You're my aunt. You're my uncle's wife. Robert's gone. Something frightening sounded in her voice. And we are both sick. Who will understand you better than I do? Who would love you like that? Get out, he muttered through gritted teeth. You don't understand, she thrashed around the room. I've thought this through. I have the money. We'll start a new life. We'll take our meds together, take care of each other. Take care? He laughed. Like you took care of me when you infected me? It was fate. Her eyes glittered feverishly. A sign that we were meant to be together. Like Robert and I, we had a shared secret, a shared pain. Robert infected you by accident. Jason felt nausea coming on. And you kept silent on purpose, consciously doomed me to this. Out of love, she shouted. Everything I've done is out of love for you. That's not love, he shook his head. It's a disease, an obsession. You're sick, Aunt Lynn. You need help. I need you. She stepped closer. Just you. It's always been just you. What about Uncle Robert? Do you even remember him? Robert betrayed me. Her voice trailed off into a shriek. Infected me and left me alone to live with it. And you took care of me, supported me. Because I loved you like an aunt, Jason yelled. Like family. And you twisted it all, turned it into some kind of dirt. She suddenly calmed down, smiled a creepy, frozen smile. You know what I realized? She said quietly. You will never be with me of your own free will, but you have no choice. Now we are bound forever, by one blood, by one disease. Get out! He pushed her toward the door. Now. No! She clutched at his shirt. You can't chase me away. You're mine, only mine. Let go. He tried to tear her arms away. If I can't have you, she whispered, no one will. Something gleamed in her hand. A sharp pain pierced his side. Jason jerked back, saw the blood on his shirt, the kitchen knife in Linda's hand. What are you? He pressed his hand to the wound. We'll be together now, she smiled through her tears. Forever. He staggered back, tripping over the coffee table. Linda stepped toward him, bringing the knife in for another stab. Stop, he put his hand out. Aunt Lynn, wake up. I love you, she whispered, and lunged forward. It all happened too fast. He instinctively pushed her away, harder than he meant to. She flew back against the wall, hitting her head on the edge of a bookshelf. There was a thud. Linda slowly settled to the floor. The knife fell from her unclenched fingers. A thin trickle of blood ran down her temple. Aunt Lynn. He sank down beside her. God, no. Her eyes were open, but her gaze was already glassy. A strange smile froze on her lips. Jason, she whispered faintly. I'm sorry. I just wanted love. Her head tilted to the side involuntarily. He felt for a pulse. Nothing. There was a ringing in his ears. He stared at the lifeless body of the woman who had been a second mother to him, and then turned into a possessed demon that had ruined his life. The blood from his wound was mixing with her blood on the floor. Now they were truly bound forever, not by love, not by disease, but by this final, terrible moment. With shaking hands, he pulled out his cell phone, dialed the number. 9111, I need the police. I think I killed my aunt. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. A normal day for everyone but the two of them. A day when obsession and betrayal led to the final tragedy, cutting two lives short with one stroke of fate. In 2 weeks, Jason had lost everything. Kate listened to his confused confession, silently packed her things, and left. So many sick days had piled up at work that Pete had been forced to fire him. Sorry, kid, but clients can't wait forever. Now he sat in the empty apartment, mindlessly going through the things in the box Kate had forgotten to pick up. Their photos together, movie tickets, funny cards with declarations of love. Every little thing was a reminder of a happy life that had turned to rubble. The bedroom still smelled of her perfume. Her engagement ring lay on the nightstand. She'd taken it off silently, without saying a word. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom, pink, with a funny kitten on the handle. He couldn't bring himself to throw those things away. They were the last reminder that happiness wasn't a dream. Dr. Rodriguez had said that with modern medicines, you could live a long, almost normal life. You'll have children, a family, everything like everyone else, she assured him. But how do you build a normal life when the very notion of normalcy has been shattered? The doorbell rang like a gunshot in the silence of the apartment. Linda stood on the doorstep, gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes and a feverish glint in her eyes. She was wearing the same dress she'd worn at Robert's funeral. What do you want? He asked tiredly, not moving from his seat. To talk. She stepped into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. She smelled of alcohol. I owe you an explanation. You've already explained everything, he grumbled. Go away. No, listen. She grabbed his hand. Her fingers were icy. I know how to make things right. We can be together. I'll sell the house. We'll go somewhere where no one knows us. Have you lost your mind? He wrenched his hand away. You're my aunt. You're my uncle's wife. Robert's gone. Something frightening, almost insane, sounded in her voice. And we are both sick. Who will understand you better than I do? Who would love you like that? She thrashed around the room like a wounded animal, hitting furniture, knocking pictures off the walls. Her movements were abrupt, jerky, like she was trying to shake off something invisible. You don't understand, her voice trailed off. I've thought of everything. I have Robert's insurance money. We'll start a new life. We'll take our meds together, take care of each other. Take care of each other? He laughed, a terrible, barking laugh. Like you took care of me when you infected me? It was fate. Her eyes burned with an unhealthy fire. A sign that we were meant to be together. Like Robert and I. We had a shared secret, a shared pain. Robert infected you by accident. Jason felt nausea coming up to his throat. And you stayed silent on purpose. Consciously doomed me to this. Out of love, she shouted, grabbing her head. Everything I've done is out of love for you. Can't you see it? Can't you feel it? We are meant for each other. She looked pathetic and terrified at the same time. Her hair disheveled, her mascara smeared, her hands trembling. Nothing left of the elegant, collected woman she'd always been. This isn't love. He shook his head. It's a disease, an obsession. You need help, Aunt Lynn. I need you. She stepped closer. She smelled of whiskey and some kind of medicine. Just you. It's always been just you. Ever since the day you comforted me so maturely at your parents' funeral. What about Uncle Robert? He twitched. Do you even remember him? Robert betrayed me! Her voice trailed off into a shriek. Infected me and left me alone to live with it. And you took care of me, supported me, because I loved you like an aunt, Jason yelled. Like family, and you twisted it all, turned it into some kind of filth. She suddenly froze, as if petrified. A smile slowly spread across her face, creepy, frozen, like a mask. You know what I realized? She said in almost a whisper. You will never be with me of your own free will, but you have no choice. Now we are bound forever, by one blood, by one disease. You are mine, only mine. Get out! He grabbed her by the shoulders, dragging her toward the door. Now! No! She clutched at his shirt with a deadening grip. You can't drive me away! If I can't have you... Her voice dropped to a whisper. No one will. Something gleamed in the light of the lamp. A sharp pain pierced his side. Jason jerked back, saw the blood on his shirt, the kitchen knife in her hand. What are you? He pressed his hand against the wound, trying to realize what was happening. We'll be together now. She smiled through her tears, taking a step forward. Forever. He backed up, tripping over the coffee table. The box of Kate's belongings fell, scattering the contents. Photos, letters, the minutiae of their past lives fanning across the floor. Linda stepped toward him, drawing her knife for another stab. Madness splashed in her eyes. Stop! He put out his hand. Aunt Lynn, wake up! I love you, she whispered and lunged forward. It all happened too fast. He instinctively pushed her away, harder than he intended. She flew back against the wall, hitting her head on the edge of a bookshelf. There was a muffled, sickening sound. Linda slowly settled to the floor like a rag doll. The knife fell from her unclenched fingers, clinking on the parquet. A thin trickle of blood ran down her temple, losing itself in her graying hair. Aunt Lynn? He sank down beside her. God, no. Her eyes were open, but her gaze was already glassy. A strange, almost peaceful smile froze on her lips. Jason, she breathed out faintly. I'm sorry. I just wanted love. Her head tilted to the side helplessly. He felt for a pulse. Nothing. There was a ringing in his ears. He stared at the lifeless body of the woman who had been a second mother to him, and then turned into a possessed demon that had ruined his life. The blood from his wound slowly soaked through his shirt, dripping onto the floor, mixing with her blood. Now they were truly bound forever, not by love, not by disease, but by this final, terrible moment. He sat next to the body, unable to move. His mind was empty. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized that he had to do something. Call the police, an ambulance, someone else. But it all seemed distant and unreal. Outside the window, Dawn was breaking. A normal day for everyone but the two of them. A day when obsession and betrayal led to the final tragedy, cutting two lives short with one stroke of fate. The last ray of sunlight fell on a photograph lying among Kate's scattered belongings. It showed the three of them, he, Kate, and Aunt Linda, smiling happily for the camera. It was at their engagement party, just 3 months ago. A lifetime ago. Jason rose slowly. The wound in his side throbbed with a dull ache. He had to do something. Somewhere to go. But first he must decide what to do with the body of Aunt Linda, who had loved him so much and so terribly that love had killed them both. The silence rang in his ears. Jason stared at Aunt Linda's body spread out on the floor of his apartment and tried to force himself to think rationally. The blood had already begun to dry, turning into dark stains on the light-colored parquet. What to do? You can't call the police. They would immediately realize what had happened in his apartment. There's blood on his clothes, signs of a struggle. Yes, it was self-defense, but who would believe it? He cautiously looked out the window. It's 3 a.m., the yard's empty. His pickup truck is parked right outside the driveway, if we act fast. Jason pulled an old blanket from the closet and spread it on the floor. Every movement was painful in his wounded side, but he forced himself to move methodically, not to panic. Wrap the body, tighten the knots. Find gloves, can't leave prints, wipe the blood off the floor, at least the most visible stains. The bundle was unexpectedly heavy. Jason struggled to drag it to the elevator, praying no one was out in the driveway at this hour. Loading it into the car took several agonizing minutes. He looked around every now and then, but the street was deserted. Only a flashing streetlight and a distant siren broke the silence of the night. Jason sat down behind the wheel, gripping it to his knuckles. Where to go? Someplace remote enough, but not too late to find the body, and make it look like a random attack. He thought of a wooded area about half an hour outside of town. There's a lot of dog walkers, bicyclists riding in the mornings. They'd find him quickly, but not so quickly as to link him to it. The road seemed endless. Every oncoming car made my heart skip a beat. Every traffic light seemed like an eternity. The wound in my side throbbed to the beat of my heart. Finally, there was a turn onto a dirt road. Jason pulled off the highway, driving slowly in the darkness. His headlights picked out tree trunks that looked like sentries. He drove another half-mile and stopped. He'd walk the rest of the way. He couldn't leave tire tracks too close. Pulling the body out was even harder than loading it. The wound was open, fresh blood running down his side, but he couldn't afford to be weak. Jason dragged the bundle deep into the forest, stumbling over roots. After about 200 meters, his strength began to leave him. Here, this should be enough. He unwrapped the blanket. Aunt Linda's body seemed unnaturally small in the dim moonlight. He unzipped her purse, scattered the contents, making it look like a robbery. The knife. He should take the knife. It had his blood on it. He can keep the rest. Let them think she'd been attacked in the woods, robbed, killed. One last look at the woman who had been a second mother to him. Her face seemed peaceful in death, as if she'd finally found the peace she'd so desperately sought. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not knowing himself what he was apologizing for. The walk back to the car merged into one endless nightmare. Every rustle seemed like a police siren, every shadow a witness to his crime. He got home at dawn, thoroughly washed the car, burned his clothes, wiped off all traces of blood in the apartment. He hastily dressed the wound. He couldn't go to the doctor. They'd start asking questions. In the morning, John Henderson was walking his Labradors in the woods. The dogs were the first to smell something wrong. They barked, pulled their leashes away from the path. "Quiet, girls!" he shouted, but the dogs wouldn't stop, and then he saw it. A woman's body sprawled between the trees like a broken doll, the scattered belongings from her purse, traces of blood on the grass. With shaky hands, John pulled out his cell phone, dialed 911. "Police? I want to report a murder." An hour later, the scene was swarming with cops. Detective Ray Thornton glumly examined the body while forensics took measurements and photographs. "Looks like a robbery," the young officer observed. "Bags trashed, jewelry ripped off." Thornton nodded silently, but something made him uneasy. Things were too neatly scattered. too far off the path the victim had been carried. And why was she even in the woods deep at night? Have you got an ID? Yes, sir. Linda Clark, 44 years old, widow. Lived alone after her husband died. Thornton pulled out a notebook. Linda Clark's story was just beginning, and he had a feeling it would prove far more complicated than a simple robbery in the woods. Meanwhile, Jason sat in his apartment, staring out the window at the police cars arriving. The neighbors were already starting to whisper. It seemed a woman had been killed. A body had been found in the woods. He closed his eyes. Now the investigation will begin. They would interview relatives, look for clues, reconstruct the last hours of Aunt Linda's life. Will he be able to keep his composure when they come asking questions? Will he have the strength to lie when he looks the detective in the eye? Would the wound that still bled with every movement give him away? The sun was rising over the city, a normal morning for everyone but him. A morning that began the countdown to the moment when the truth would come out, because the truth always comes out, sooner or later. The phone vibrated. Kate. She'd probably heard the news by now. He didn't answer it. What could he say to her? How could he explain that the woman who'd destroyed their happiness was now dead, and he'd had everything to do with it? Jason stood up, wincing in pain. He had to pull himself together. The questions would come soon, and he had to have answers ready. Convincing answers that would leave no room for suspicion. The game has begun. A game of hide and seek with justice where his freedom was at stake. And he must win for his own sake, for his future, for the memory of the man he had been before that terrible night. Outside the window, a police siren wailed. The hunt was on. Detective Ray Thornton spread the crime scene photos on his desk. The tire tracks on the dirt road, the crumpled grass, the victim's scattered belongings all pointed to a routine robbery that ended in murder. But something about this picture persistently scratched his professional instincts. "What do we got?" he asked his partner, Detective Morgan. Linda Clark, 44 years old, manager at an insurance company. Widow. Husband died 6 months ago of a heart attack. Lives alone, no children. Only close relative is a nephew, Jason Clark. Have you interviewed him? Yeah, this morning. Says he hasn't seen his aunt in days. Seems depressed they were close. Thornton picked up the pathologist's report. Death was caused by the head hitting a hard surface. There were signs of struggle on the body, skin samples under the fingernails. The victim had fought back. And this is interesting. Morgan placed the phone records on the table. She's been calling her nephew 20 times a day for the last month. Messages, calls, voicemails. Sounds like compulsive stalking to me. Show me their latest correspondence. Morgan held out the folder. Thornton immersed himself in reading it, and his eyebrows slowly crept upward. I'll fix it. We have to be together. Only you will understand me. He shook his head. It's not like an aunt and nephew socializing. There's something else. Morgan pulled out another folder. Medical records. Both of them have been diagnosed with HIV. Her 2 years ago, him 2 weeks ago. Thornton leaned back in his chair, connecting the dots in his head. Check his medical records. Any history of trauma referrals in the last few days? Already checked? No. But a neighbor says she saw him yesterday. He was holding his side and limping. Interesting. Thornton stood up, walked over to the picture board. Very interesting. The next day they visited Jason again. He didn't open right away, moving stiffly. Come in, detectives. His voice sounded tired. Any news? Yes, Mr. Clark, and a lot of questions. Thornton looked around the apartment carefully. Freshly mopped floors, new carpet in the living room. How long ago were the renovations done? Yesterday. Jason tensed. Spilled paint, had to replace the flooring. I see. The detective pulled out his cell phone. Tell me, do these messages from your aunt seem normal to you? Jason turned pale as he read the correspondence. She wasn't herself after my uncle died, he muttered. I tried to keep my distance. So unhinged that she infected you with HIV? A heavy silence hung in the room. What do you mean? Jason's voice shook. We checked your medical records. It's an interesting coincidence. Your aunt finds out about her diagnosis 2 years ago, and you 2 weeks ago. And right after that, she starts stalking you, writing strange messages. I don't see where you're going with this. Really? Thornton stepped closer. I think you do, as well as why you're limping and holding your side. They found traces of skin under the victim's fingernails. Do you want to submit a DNA sample voluntarily, or should we get a warrant? Jason collapsed into his chair, covering his face with his hands. She came here that night. His voice sounded muffled. Drunk, loopy, talked about love, about how we should be together, and then she pulled out a knife. And you pushed her away? In self-defense? Yes. She hit her head on a shelf. I didn't mean to. I was just defending myself. And then you decided to stage a robbery? Thornton took a seat across from him. Instead of calling the police? Who would have believed it? Jason raised haggard eyes to him. An aunt in love with her nephew, infected him with HIV, attacking him with a knife. That sounds like bullshit. But it's true, the detective said softly. And now you're going to have to tell it to the court. Thornton listened to Jason's confession, and gradually the story of insane obsession took on flesh and blood. I loved her like a mother, Jason's voice trailed off. After my parents died, she and Uncle Robert replaced my family. And then, the night after my uncle's funeral, we both got drunk. She was crying. I tried to comfort her. One thing led to another. You didn't know about her illness at the time? No, we agreed to forget about it. Put it down to grief and alcohol. I thought it was over. I had a fiancé, plans for the future. And 2 weeks ago, you found out the diagnosis? Yes, went to the doctor because of the constant fatigue. When Dr. Rodriguez said HIV, I couldn't believe it. I've always been faithful to Kate, except for that one time. The detective nodded silently, making notes. Linda Clark's story unfolded before him like a Greek tragedy. Love turned obsession, betrayal, revenge, death. He studied her computer. Dozens of folders of Jason's photos, diary entries full of morbid fantasies. She'd created an entire imaginary world where they were together. I think her husband's death finally pushed her over the edge, reasoned the psychiatrist who studied the case files. Loneliness, guilt over her illness, and a forbidden passion for her nephew all created a rattling mixture. Thornton reviewed surveillance footage from that night. Linda entering Jason's driveway, his pickup truck pulling out of the yard 2 hours later, him again, returning at dawn. Do you realize what awaits you? He asked Jason. Even if the court accepts the self-defense version, covering up a crime, moving a body, those are serious charges. I understand, the man nodded. But you know, part of me is glad things have come out in the open. It's impossible to live with that burden. In the courtroom, Jason kept his cool. He told it like it was, unvarnished and without excuses. The jury listened to the story of a man whose life had been ruined by the mad passion of a woman he trusted. Kate came to the hearing. Sitting in the last row, she didn't look up. As Jason was being led away, she whispered, "I'm sorry." He didn't look back. The sentence was lenient, 3 years with parole. The court took into account all the circumstances, self-defense, the victim's mental state, her criminal actions to infect her nephew. Thornton visited Jason in prison a month later. How are you? Strangely better, the man smiled for the first time in a while. There's time to think here, to understand, accept. And then what? I'll start over, in a different city with a clean slate. Dr. Rodriguez says with modern therapy, you can live a long and fulfilling life. You're a strong man, Jason. You know, Detective, I don't blame Aunt Linda. She was sick, both in mind and body. I guess somewhere in the back of her mind she really believed she was doing it out of love. Thornton watched the prison gates close behind Jason's back. Another case closed, another tragedy solved. But somehow, for some reason, there was a bitterness in his heart. In his pocket was Linda's last letter, found in her desk. I'm sorry, Jason. I know my love ruined your life, but I couldn't have done it any other way. When you love so much, you stop seeing the lines between truth and lies, good and evil. I hope one day you'll understand. She never sent that letter. Maybe at the last moment she realized the horror of what she'd done. Or maybe she still believed in her own twisted version of love. Thornton tucked the letter back into the case file. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some wounds don't heal completely. All that's left is to move on, carrying your cross and trying to find meaning in a senseless tragedy. On his office wall hung a picture of the Clark family, still happy, still whole. Robert hugging his wife, a smiling Jason beside him. They didn't know that fate had already drawn its terrible sword over them. That love, the most beautiful of human feelings, could become a destructive force, sweeping away everything in its path. The detective turned off the light and left the office. Tomorrow there would be new cases, new tragedies, new mysteries. And the story of the Clark family would be another reminder of how thin the line between love and obsession, between passion and insanity. Somewhere in the city jail, Jason stared out the window at the night sky, trying to imagine his new life after everything. And in the Clark family crypt, Aunt Linda finally found peace next to the husband she'd betrayed and the nephew she'd loved too much. The curtain has fallen. The tragedy is over.